I still checked my locks twice every night before bed, and it's been 8 months since I quit working the overnight shift at Burger King. What happened on March 15, 2023, changed everything I thought I knew about workplace safety and the people we serve every day. My name is Marcus, and I'd been working the night shift at the Burger King on Industrial Boulevard in Bakersfield, California for about 6 months. The pay wasn't great, but I needed the work, and honestly, most nights were pretty quiet. We'd get the usual crowd late-night workers grabbing dinner, people getting off second shift, the occasional drunk person wanting food. Nothing I couldn't handle. But there was this one customer who started coming in around February. Always ordered the same thing: 2 Whopper meals, large fries, large Coke. Always paid in exact change. Always came in between 2:30 and 3 a.m. when it was just me and my manager, Patricia, working the store. The guy seemed normal enough at first. Middle-aged, average height, always wore a baseball cap and kept his head down. Never made small talk, just ordered his food and left. But after a few weeks, I started noticing things that made me uncomfortable. He always sat in the same booth, the corner one where he could see both the front counter and the back kitchen area. He never ate the food there. He'd just sit for exactly 20 minutes, watching us work, then take the bags and leave. Patricia said he was probably just tired from work and needed a place to decompress, but something about the way he watched us felt wrong. Then I noticed he was taking pictures. It was subtle at first. He'd have his phone out like he was texting, but I caught the camera flash a couple times. When I mentioned it to Patricia, she said maybe he was just documenting poor service or something, and as long as he wasn't bothering other customers, we should leave him alone. Corporate policy was to avoid confrontation unless absolutely necessary. But it got worse. I started noticing the same dark blue sedan parked across the street during my shifts, even on nights when the guy didn't come in for food. It would sit there for hours with the engine running. When I'd go out for my smoke break, I could see someone in the driver's seat, but I could never make out who it was. The breaking point came on that Tuesday night in March. It had been raining all evening, and we'd been dead since about midnight. Patricia was in the back doing inventory, and I was cleaning the grill when our regular came in. Same order, same routine, but this time something was different. When I handed him his food, he looked up at me for the first time. Really looked at me. And he smiled. It wasn't a friendly smile, it was the kind of smile that makes your stomach drop and sets off every alarm bell in your head. "You live on Maple Avenue, don't you, Marcus?" he said quietly. I felt the blood drain from my face. I'd never told him my name, and my address sure as hell wasn't something I'd ever shared with a customer. My name tag just said corporate policy to protect employee privacy. "I don't know what you're talking about," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. He leaned closer to the counter. "Apartment 4B. Red Toyota Camry. You leave for work at 9:45 p.m. every night. Take Elm Drive to get here." My hands started shaking. He knew my address, my car, my schedule. This wasn't some random customer, this was someone who'd been watching me, following me. "I think you should leave," I said louder this time, hoping Patricia would hear me from the back. But he just kept smiling. "I know a lot about you, Marcus. About Patricia, too. Did you know she stops at the grocery store on 2nd Street every Thursday after work? Buys cat food and frozen dinners. Lives alone in that little house on Pine Road." That's when I knew we were in serious trouble. This wasn't just about me, he'd been surveilling both of us, learning our routines, our vulnerabilities. I reached for the panic button under the counter, but he saw the movement. "I wouldn't do that if I were you," he said calmly. "See, I've been watching this place for weeks. I know your security protocols, your shift schedules, when the police patrol this area. They won't get here for at least 12 minutes, and I can do a lot in 12 minutes. That's when Patricia came out from the back, and I saw her face go white when she saw the customer. She recognized him too, but not from the store. "Hello, Patricia," he said, turning toward her. "It's been a long time." "Oh God," she whispered. "David, what are you doing here?" My mind was racing. Patricia knew this guy? How? And why was she looking at him like she'd seen a ghost? David, apparently that was his name, reached into his jacket pocket, and I tensed, ready to dive behind the counter. But he just pulled out a manila envelope. "These are for you," he said, sliding it across the counter to Patricia. "Photos of you and your new friend here. At work, at home, running errands. You look good, Patricia. Prison must have been easier on you than it was on me." Prison? Patricia had been in prison? I looked at my manager, this woman I'd worked with for months, who'd trained me, who'd covered for me when I was late, and realized I didn't know her at all. "David, please," Patricia said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I served my time. I've been clean for 3 years. I just want to live my life." "What about my life?" David's voice was getting harder, angrier. "What about the 5 years I lost because you decided to make a deal with the prosecutors? You think I forgot about that?" I was starting to understand what was happening. Patricia and this David had been involved in something illegal together. She'd made some kind of plea deal that sent him to prison while she got a lighter sentence. And now he was out, and he'd tracked her down. "I should call the police," I said, but David laughed. "Go ahead. Call them. Tell them Patricia Martinez, that's not even her real name, by the way, is working under a stolen identity. Tell them she's been lying on her employment applications, violating her parole conditions, and associating with someone who doesn't know about her criminal history." Patricia's face crumpled. "Marcus, I'm sorry. I never meant for you to get involved in this." "But he is involved now," David said. "Because he's seen me, he knows my face, and he's heard this conversation. That makes him a liability." The way he said liability made my blood run cold. This wasn't just about revenge against Patricia anymore. I'd become a problem that needed to be solved. That's when I made the decision that probably saved both our lives. Instead of going for the panic button, I grabbed the industrial cleaning spray we use for the grill, the stuff with the warning labels about chemical burns, and sprayed it directly in David's face. He screamed and stumbled backward, clawing at his eyes. Patricia grabbed the phone and started dialing 911 while I vaulted over the counter and tackled David to the ground. He was bigger than me, but he was blind and disoriented, and I managed to pin him down until the police arrived. The whole thing had taken maybe 5 minutes, but it felt like hours. When the police got there, the whole story came out. David Russell had been released from San Quentin 3 months earlier after serving 5 years for armed robbery and drug trafficking. Patricia, whose real name was Rebecca Valdez, had been his girlfriend and accomplice until she got arrested and decided to cooperate with prosecutors in exchange for a reduced sentence. She'd served 18 months, got out, and tried to start over with a new identity. But David had spent 5 years in prison planning his revenge, and when he got out, he'd hired a private investigator to track her down. The really scary part was what the police found in his car. Photos of both of us, our addresses, our schedules, floor plans of Patricia's house that he'd gotten from public records, and a detailed plan of how he was going to make us both disappear. According to the detective who interviewed me later, David had been planning to wait until Patricia's day off, break into her house, and force her to call me with some emergency that would get me to come over. Then he was going to kill us both and make it look like a murder-suicide. The surveillance, the late-night visits to the restaurant, learning our routines, it was all preparation for a double homicide. Patricia quit the next day. She entered witness protection and relocated to another state. I never saw her again, but the detective told me she was cooperating with federal investigators who were looking into other crimes David might have committed while he was planning his revenge. David is back in prison now, this time for stalking, terroristic threats, and conspiracy to commit murder. He'll be eligible for parole in 2035, when he's 67 years old. But honestly, I don't think I'll ever feel completely safe knowing he's still alive. The thing that haunts me most isn't just what happened that night. It's thinking about all the times he sat in that booth, watching us, planning how he was going to kill us, while we served him food and tried to be friendly. How many conversations did I have with Patricia about normal stuff, weekend plans, TV shows, work gossip while a man 20 feet away was deciding the best way to murder us both. I quit Burger King 2 days later and took a job at a warehouse where I worked day shifts with dozens of other people around. I still look over my shoulder when I'm walking to my car. I still check the locks on my apartment door twice every night. And I never, ever work alone with just one other person anymore. The worst part is realizing how little you actually know about the people around you. Patricia had worked there for 2 years before I started. Everyone liked her. She was helpful, reliable, good at her job. She'd even given me career advice about moving up in the company. And the whole time, she was living under a fake name, hiding from someone who wanted to kill her for sending him to prison. How do you process that? How do you trust anyone after learning that your manager, someone you saw 5 nights a week for 6 months, was essentially in witness protection and didn't tell anyone? But here's what really keeps me up at night. David Russell had been planning this for months. He'd found Patricia, learned her routine, figured out where she worked. But instead of just confronting her or reporting her to the authorities, he decided to study everyone around her too. He learned about me, my schedule, my address, because he knew I'd be a witness to whatever he planned to do. Which means from the moment he started coming into that Burger King, I was already marked for death. I just didn't know it. The detective told me that people getting out of prison with revenge plans is more common than most people realize. They have years to plan, nothing but time to think about payback, and when they get out, they're focused and determined. The scary part is how patient they can be, how willing they are to spend months setting up the perfect scenario. What if I hadn't noticed the photography? What if I hadn't gotten suspicious about the car in the parking lot? What if Patricia had called in sick that night, and it had just been me alone when David decided to make his move? I think about that a lot. How many people are out there right now, planning something terrible, just waiting for the right moment? How many seemingly normal customers, coworkers, or neighbors are actually dangerous people with hidden agendas? I've been working at the warehouse for 8 months now, and I like the job. Good pay, good benefits, regular hours. But sometimes when I'm walking to my car after my shift, I'll notice someone in the parking lot who seems to be paying too much attention to me, and my heart starts racing again. Because once you've been targeted by someone like David Russell, once you've looked into the eyes of someone who's been planning to kill you for months, you realize how thin the line is between normal life and absolute terror. And you never really feel completely safe again. I found out later that the private investigator David hired to find Patricia had also been tracking 3 other people, former friends of theirs who might have testified against him. 2 of them had moved states away and changed their names. The third one, well, the police are still investigating what happened to him. So here's my question for anyone listening to this. Have you ever had a regular customer, a coworker, or even a neighbor who paid just a little too much attention to you? Someone who seemed to know things about your routine that you never told them. Someone who made you uncomfortable but you couldn't quite put your finger on why. Because after what I went through, I'm convinced that most of the time when something feels wrong, it probably is wrong. Trust your instincts. Report suspicious behavior. And never assume that just because someone seems normal, they actually are normal. You never know who's watching you, or why. I've been avoiding this story for 2 years now, but after what happened to that security guard in Springfield last month, I think people need to know what really goes on in some of these places after dark. My name is Jennifer, and what I discovered during my shift at Restwood Memorial Cemetery on July 14, 2022, changed everything I thought I knew about the funeral industry and the people who work in it. I'd been working as a night groundskeeper at Restwood Memorial in Toledo, Ohio for about 8 months. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid decent money, $18 an hour, to maintain the grounds from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m., Monday through Friday. Most nights were quiet. I'd check the perimeter fence, make sure no teenagers had snuck in to drink or vandalize headstones, and do basic maintenance like clearing debris from walkways and checking the irrigation system. The cemetery covered about 40 acres on the outskirts of town, with sections dating back to the 1890s. During the day, it was peaceful families visiting graves, funeral services, the occasional historian researching old family plots. But at night, it was just me, the security cameras, and my radio connection to the main office. What most people don't realize is that cemeteries are actually targets for a lot of criminal activity. Copper thieves try to steal metal from decorative fixtures. Vandals damage headstones for fun. Drug dealers sometimes use remote sections as meeting spots. Part of my job was deterring that kind of activity and reporting anything suspicious to my supervisor, Thomas Rivera, who managed security for the entire Restwood Memorial Group 3 cemeteries in the Toledo area. But that night in July, I discovered something that went way beyond typical vandalism or theft. I was doing my usual 2 a.m. perimeter check when I noticed fresh tire tracks in the soft dirt near the service entrance on Commerce Street. The tracks were deep, like from a heavy truck, and they led toward the older section of the cemetery where we rarely had vehicle traffic. My first thought was that maybe the city had done some unexpected utility work, but there was no paperwork about any scheduled maintenance. Following the tracks with my flashlight, I noticed they led directly to a section of graves from the 1920s and 1930s, an area that had been having some subsidence issues lately. Several of the older concrete vaults had been shifting, and we'd been planning to do some stabilization work, but it wasn't scheduled to start until the following month. That's when I saw the excavation. Someone had dug up grave plot 247C, the burial site of a woman named Eleanor Hoffman who died in 1934. But this wasn't random vandalism or some teenagers playing a prank. This was professional work, clean, precise digging with proper equipment. The vault had been opened with power tools, and whoever did it knew exactly what they were doing. My first instinct was to call it in immediately. Grave desecration is a felony, and even though I'd never seen anything like this before, I knew it was serious. But as I was reaching for my radio, I heard vehicles approaching from the service road. I killed my flashlight and crouched behind a large memorial monument, trying to stay hidden. 2 pickup trucks with their headlights off were driving slowly toward the excavation site. I could see at least 4 people getting out of the vehicles, and they were carrying equipment, shovels, tarps, and what looked like a portable hoist. That's when I realized this wasn't just grave robbing. This was organized, and these people were coming back to finish whatever they'd started. I managed to get a partial license plate number on one of the truck's Ohio plates starting with GH7. But as I was trying to get a better look at the people, I recognized one of the voices. It was my supervisor, Thomas Rivera. My blood went cold. Thomas was directing the operation, telling the other men where to position their equipment. He wasn't just aware of what was happening, he was running it. "We need to move fast," I heard him say. "The new girl does her rounds every 2 hours, and she'll be back through this section around 4 a.m. The new girl. He was talking about me. I realized that Thomas had been scheduling my patrol routes specifically to give them windows of opportunity. He knew my schedule, my routes, my radio check-in times. Everything I reported to him about suspicious activity, he'd been using to plan around my presence. But what were they doing? Why were they opening a grave from 1934? I watched in horror as they used the hoist to lift something out of Eleanor Hoffman's vault. It wasn't a body after nearly 90 years, there wouldn't be much left anyway. It was a metal container, about the size of a large suitcase. "That's the last one from this section," Thomas said. "How many does that make total?" 17, one of the other men replied. "All from the same time period, all buried with the same funeral home." That's when it clicked. They weren't randomly desecrating graves, they were targeting specific burials from a particular funeral home during a specific era. This was systematic. I stayed hidden while they loaded the container into one of the trucks and began filling in the grave. They worked efficiently, like they'd done this many times before. Within an hour, you could barely tell the site had been disturbed. After they left, I waited another 30 minutes before approaching the grave site. Using my phone's camera, I documented everything I could: the disturbed soil, tire tracks, footprints. But I faced a terrible dilemma. How do you report criminal activity when your supervisor is the one committing the crimes? I decided to finish my shift normally and figure out my next move during the day. But when I got home that morning, I started researching Eleanor Hoffman and the funeral home that had handled her burial in 1934. What I found made my skin crawl. Hoffman Funeral Services, no relation to Eleanor, just a coincidence in names, had been one of Toledo's most prominent funeral homes from 1920 to 1938. They'd handled burials for some of the city's wealthiest families during the height of the Depression. But in 1938, the business had suddenly closed after the owner, Frederick Hoffman, disappeared along with a substantial amount of money that families had paid for perpetual care of their loved ones' graves. According to newspaper archives, Frederick Hoffman had been under investigation for embezzlement when he vanished. The rumor was that he'd stolen over $200,000 worth, millions in today's money, from client families who'd paid in advance for decades of grave maintenance and memorial services. The money was never found, and Hoffman was never seen again. But what if he hadn't stolen the money? What if he'd hidden it? During the Depression, a lot of wealthy people didn't trust banks and buried their valuables or kept them in private safety deposit boxes. What if some of Hoffman's clients had asked him to bury precious items, jewelry, gold, cash, with their deceased relatives? And what if Frederick Hoffman had kept detailed records of which graves contained these hidden treasures? It would explain everything. Thomas and his crew weren't just randomly robbing graves, they were using Frederick Hoffman's records to systematically loot the valuables that had been buried with Hoffman Funeral Services clients in the 1920s and 1930s. But how had Thomas gotten access to those records? And how long had this been going on? I spent the next day trying to figure out who I could trust. Going to the police seemed like the obvious choice, but I had no idea how deep this conspiracy went. Thomas had been with Westwood Memorial for 15 years and had connections throughout the funeral industry. If other people were involved, reporting it to the wrong person could put me in serious danger. Instead, I decided to gather more evidence. Over the next 3 nights, I carefully documented my patrol routes and noted any areas where I found signs of recent digging or ground disturbance. What I discovered was horrifying. They'd been at this for months, maybe years. I found at least 12 grave sites that showed evidence of having been opened and carefully resealed. All from the same era, all originally handled by Hoffman Funeral Services. On my 4th night back, July 18th, I made a decision that probably saved my life. Instead of doing my normal patrol route, I hid near the service entrance with a camera, waiting to see if they came back. They did. This time, there were 3 trucks and at least 8 people. I recognized Thomas, but I also recognized 2 other men, Carl Sutton, who worked maintenance at Westwood Memorial during the day, and Mike Wheeler, who drove one of the funeral transport vehicles. This wasn't just Thomas going rogue. This was an organized operation involving multiple employees, possibly spanning years. I managed to get clear photos of the license plates, the faces of several participants, and video of them excavating another grave. But as I was recording, my phone's flash accidentally went off. One of the men saw it. "Someone's out there," he shouted, pointing in my direction. I ran. I've never been so terrified in my life. I could hear them chasing me through the cemetery, shouting to each other, trying to coordinate their search. I knew the grounds better than they did, but there were 8 of them and only 1 of me. I made it to my car and got out of there, but I knew I couldn't go home. If they'd recognized me, my address would be in my employment file. Instead, I drove straight to the Ohio State Police barracks and turned over everything I'd documented. The investigation that followed was massive. It turned out that Thomas Rivera and his crew had been systematically robbing graves for over 3 years. They'd recovered Frederick Hoffman's client records from a storage unit that had been abandoned when the funeral home closed in 1938. The records detailed which families had requested valuables to be buried with their deceased relatives. In total, they'd looted 47 graves and stolen items worth an estimated $1.2 million, antique jewelry, gold coins, family heirlooms, and even cash that families had buried with their loved ones during the uncertain times of the Great Depression. But the worst part was the cover-up. Thomas had been falsifying maintenance records, scheduling my patrol routes to avoid his digging sites, and even reporting fake vandalism incidents to throw off suspicion when families noticed that memorial decorations were missing from graves. Carl Sutton, the day maintenance worker, had been responsible for repairing the sites after they were robbed, making it look like natural settling or weather damage. Mike Wheeler had been using the funeral transport vehicles to move the stolen goods, knowing that nobody would question a funeral home vehicle being in a cemetery at odd hours. They'd also been bribing Robert Nash, one of the security guards who worked weekends, to look the other way during their operations. Nash was the one who'd been giving them advance notice if police or other authorities were planning to patrol the area. The entire operation fell apart once I came forward, but the legal consequences were complicated. Many of the families whose graves had been robbed were dead themselves, or their descendants had moved away decades ago. Some of the stolen items couldn't even be positively identified because the original burial records had been lost when Hoffman Funeral Services closed. Thomas Rivera was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for conspiracy, grave desecration, and theft. Carl Sutton got 5 years. Mike Wheeler got 3 years plus community service. Robert Nash was fired and faced civil penalties but avoided jail time in exchange for his cooperation with investigators. But here's what still haunts me: how many other cemeteries have employees doing the same thing? How many funeral homes have staff members who've figured out which graves contain valuables and are systematically looting them? After the investigation, I learned that grave robbing is much more common than most people realize. Modern security systems have made it harder, but employees with inside access can still exploit their positions. And in older cemeteries with limited oversight, it can go on for years without being detected. I transferred to a different job after the trial. I couldn't handle being in cemeteries anymore, especially at night. Every shadow, every sound made me think someone was watching me. The company offered me counseling, but how do you get therapy for discovering that your workplace was being used as a systematic crime scene? The thing that bothers me most is thinking about all the families who buried precious items with their loved ones as a final gesture of love and respect, only to have those items stolen by people they trusted to protect those graves. Some of those families had scraped together money during the Depression to buy a nice piece of jewelry or a family heirloom to bury with their mother or father, and decades later, some criminal with a security badge dug it up and sold it. I also think about how close I came to being seriously hurt or killed. If I hadn't run when I did, if they'd caught me in that cemetery with evidence of their operation, what would they have done? Thomas Rivera had already demonstrated that he was willing to commit felonies to protect his scheme. Would he have been willing to commit violence to protect it too? The detective who worked my case told me that criminal operations like this often escalate when they're threatened with exposure. Grave robbing can become assault, kidnapping, or even murder when the stakes get high enough. 6 months after the arrests, I got a call from a reporter who'd been investigating similar cases in other states. Apparently, organized grave robbing operations have been discovered in Pennsylvania, Michigan, and North Carolina, always involving funeral home or cemetery employees, always targeting graves from the early to mid-20th century when people commonly buried valuables with their deceased relatives. The reporter asked me if I thought there might be a larger network of criminals sharing information about which cemeteries and which graves to target. I told him I didn't know, but the idea keeps me awake at night. What if Thomas Rivera wasn't just running a local operation? What if he was part of something bigger, something that spans multiple states and involves dozens of corrupt funeral industry employees? What if there are criminal networks that specifically recruit people to get jobs at cemeteries and funeral homes so they can gain access to burial records and grave sites? The more I think about it, the more convinced I become that what I discovered in Toledo was just the tip of the iceberg. And that's what scares me the most. So here's my question for anyone listening: if you've ever worked in the funeral industry, have you noticed anything suspicious about your coworkers or supervisors? Have you seen unexplained digging, equipment being used after hours, or records being accessed inappropriately? And if you have family buried in older cemeteries, especially from the 1920s through 1950s, when was the last time you visited their graves? Have you noticed anything missing, any signs that the site might have been disturbed? Because after what I've learned, I'm convinced that this is happening in more places than anyone wants to admit. And the only thing that's going to stop it is people being aware, asking questions, and reporting suspicious activity. Trust me, you don't want to discover what I discovered. But if you do see something that doesn't look right, don't ignore it. And whatever you do, don't assume that just because someone wears a uniform or works for a funeral home, they're automatically trustworthy. Sometimes the people we trust to protect our most sacred spaces are the ones who are violating them. I haven't slept through the night since October 12, 2023. The sound of 4 pumps beeping still makes me break out in a cold sweat, and I can't walk past the hospital without my heart racing. My name is Angela, and what I discovered during my shift as a night custodian at Mercy General Hospital in Pittsburgh changed everything I thought I knew about patient care. I'd been working the overnight cleaning shift at Mercy General for 14 months, earning $16.50 an hour to clean patient rooms from 11 p.m. to 7 a.m., Sunday through Thursday. The 200-bed facility operated with minimal overnight staff, skeleton crews of nurses, 1 or 2 doctors, and security guards. My supervisor, Carol Washington, had 12 years with housekeeping and knew every inch of the building. The work was systematic: start with ICU, work down through medical floors, clean emergency last. Always follow strict protocols around biohazardous materials and patient privacy. What I didn't know was that Carol had been using her position to facilitate something much darker than supply theft. The first warning came in early September. I was cleaning room 314 when I noticed the patient, an elderly man recovering from bypass surgery, seemed unusually drowsy. His chart indicated he was stable and alert, but he was completely unresponsive when I entered. I mentioned it to night nurse Lisa Chin, but she said pain medications could cause deep sleep. Over the next few weeks, I noticed a disturbing pattern. Patients would be alert during evening visiting hours, but by 2 a.m. when I cleaned, they'd be unconscious or barely responsive. Then other things didn't make sense. Patients who should have been discharged were still in their rooms, unnecessary medical equipment remained connected, and most disturbing, some patients' identification bracelets had been replaced with different ones. Room 318 had supposedly housed the same patient for over 6 weeks, but the person had changed. The first patient was a heavy-set man in his 70s recovering from stroke. By October, room 318 held a thin man in his 50s, but with the same ID bracelet bearing the original patient's information. That's when I realized someone was swapping patients and using their insurance information to bill for extended stays and unnecessary procedures. I started documenting everything. Patients listed as stable, but heavily sedated. Medical procedures on unconscious patients without family present. Equipment moved inconsistently with official schedules. Carol Washington was always involved. I'd see her talking quietly with certain night nurses, reviewing charts she shouldn't access, making notes in a locked notebook. When I asked about concerning patients, her explanations sounded reasonable but didn't match my observations. The breaking point came that Tuesday night in October. I was cleaning the long-term care wing when I heard voices from room 327, supposedly empty according to the nurse's station board. Through the partially open door, I saw Carol and Dr. Richard Hoffman, a cardiac surgeon, standing over an unconscious patient connected to multiple machines. Dr. Hoffman was performing what looked like minor surgery without other medical staff present. "This is the last one for this batch," Carol said. "The paperwork shows 6 procedures over 3 weeks. Insurance will pay nearly $80,000. "What about the patient?" Dr. Hoffman asked. "He'll be transferred to the state facility tomorrow. They'll think any complications are from his original condition." They weren't just committing insurance fraud, they were performing unnecessary procedures on vulnerable patients who couldn't consent. My cleaning cart bumped the wall, making noise. "What was that?" Dr. Hoffman said. I quickly moved down the hallway, hands shaking. Minutes later, Carol appeared. "Angela," she said in her usual friendly tone. "Working hard tonight." "Just finishing this wing," I replied, trying to sound steady. I've been meaning to discuss additional responsibilities. You might be ready for more. The way she said it made my skin crawl. Additional responsibilities, like helping cover up room 327. I'm happy with my current duties. Carol studied my face, calculating how much I'd seen. Of course. Let me know if you want more. There are opportunities for the right person. The next night, instead of following normal routine, I used my keycard to explore areas I normally didn't clean, looking for evidence. In a storage room near cardiac, I found Carol's private files documenting dozens of patients who'd received additional procedures during extended stays. Many were elderly with limited family contact or transferring to long-term care where follow-up questions were unlikely. The files contained financial records showing each fraudulent procedure's revenue. Over 2 years, Carol and Dr. Hoffman had billed insurance companies for over $2.3 million in unnecessary procedures. Most disturbing was a list of patients who died during extended stays. 12 people over 18 months, all listed as dying from complications related to underlying conditions. But Carol's notes indicated several died during or after unauthorized procedures. I wasn't looking at fraud. I was looking at evidence of multiple homicides. I photographed everything, but heard footsteps. Someone was coming. I grabbed cleaning supplies, pretending to restock when Carol appeared. "What are you doing here?" This time her voice wasn't friendly. "Restocking. We were running low on 4th floor." She looked at the cabinet where she kept files. "This storage room is off limits to cleaning staff. I'll need to write you up." In her eyes, I saw she was calculating how much of a threat I posed. When I reached my car, I found a note. "Some things are better left alone. For your own safety." Instead of staying quiet, I drove straight to the FBI field office and turned over everything I'd documented. The investigation became one of Pennsylvania's largest medical fraud cases. FBI agents spent 3 weeks at Mercy General, reviewing records and gathering evidence. What they found was worse than I'd discovered. Carol and Dr. Hoffman had run their scheme for over 3 years, victimizing at least 127 patients and stealing over $4.2 million. The conspiracy was bigger. 3 other doctors, 2 nurses, and a hospital administrator were involved. They'd systematically identified vulnerable patients, elderly, limited family contact, cognitive impairments, extended their stays, performed unnecessary procedures, and covered up complications or deaths. Carol would identify patients fitting their target profile. Corrupt medical staff would perform additional procedures while patients were sedated, billing insurance for each one. If patients died during procedures, deaths were attributed to original conditions. Survivors with complications were transferred elsewhere, where problems generated additional revenue as new medical issues. Most horrifically, they used patients as practice subjects for newer doctors, billing insurance for training sessions as legitimate treatments. Of 127 identified victims, 23 died during unnecessary procedures. Dozens suffered permanent injuries. Families were told loved ones died naturally when they'd been killed by procedures they never consented to or needed. Dr. Hoffman got 25 years for conspiracy, healthcare fraud, and involuntary manslaughter. Carol got 18 years. Others received 8 to 15 years depending on involvement. Mercy General paid $47 million in settlements and was placed under federal oversight. The entire administration was replaced. But here's what terrifies me: how many other hospitals have similar schemes? The FBI agents said they were investigating comparable conspiracies in Ohio, Michigan, and West Virginia. Medical fraud targeting vulnerable patients is more common than people realize. These schemes can operate undetected for years when administrators, doctors, and staff are all involved. I work at a corporate office now. I couldn't handle medical environments anymore. But every healthcare fraud news story makes me wonder if it's isolated or part of something larger. What haunts me most is thinking about families who trusted the hospital. Imagine learning your elderly parent didn't die naturally, but was killed by unnecessary surgery for insurance money. That's the reality for 127 families in western Pennsylvania, And I'm convinced many more nationwide don't know their loved ones were victimized. 6 months after sentencing, a healthcare fraud journalist called about similar cases in Texas, Florida, and California. Corrupt hospital staff targeting vulnerable patients, operating undetected for years. She asked if I thought there might be networks sharing exploitation methods. I don't know, but the question keeps me awake. What if Carol wasn't running just a local scheme? What if criminal networks recruit people for hospital jobs to access vulnerable patients and billing systems? So here's my question. If you've worked in healthcare, have you noticed suspicious treatment or billing? Have you seen unnecessary procedures or inadequate documentation? If you have vulnerable family in hospitals, are you paying attention? Are you asking questions about procedures? Reviewing insurance statements? Patient abuse and healthcare fraud happen more than anyone admits. The only way to stop it is families being vigilant, healthcare workers speaking up, and investigators taking these crimes seriously. Don't assume someone with scrubs or a medical degree is automatically trustworthy. Sometimes the people we trust to heal us are the ones hurting us most. Trust me, you don't want to discover what I discovered. But if you see something that doesn't look right, don't ignore it. And whatever you do, don't assume that just because someone wears scrubs or has a medical degree, they're automatically trustworthy. Because after what I've learned, I'm convinced that patient abuse and healthcare fraud are happening in more places than anyone wants to admit. And the only thing that's going to stop it is people like us speaking up when we see something wrong. My name is Frank Morales, and I've been driving long haul for Westfield Freight Lines for 11 years. I've seen everything on the road: accidents, breakdowns, weather disasters, and enough weird stuff to fill a book. But what I witnessed on Interstate 40 outside Flagstaff, Arizona on February 18, 2024, connected dots I never knew existed and revealed a conspiracy that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. I was 3 days into a Seattle to Miami run, hauling electronics equipment. The load was legitimate. I'd picked it up from a Microsoft distribution center and had all the proper paperwork. But something felt off about this particular shipment from the moment I signed for it. The pickup had been rushed. Instead of the usual loading dock procedure, they'd brought me to a side entrance where 2 men in civilian clothes, not warehouse uniforms, supervised the loading. They insisted on specific placement of certain boxes and kept checking their phones nervously. "Driver needs to maintain highway speeds," one said to the other. "No extended stops except for fuel and required rest periods." That was unusual. Most electronics shipments don't have time restrictions beyond normal delivery windows. The route took me through Arizona's high desert, and I was making good time despite February weather. Light snow had been falling since Phoenix, and visibility was getting worse as I climbed elevation toward Flagstaff. Around 2:30 a.m., I was about 20 miles east of Flagstaff when I saw emergency lights ahead. 2 Arizona State Patrol vehicles and what looked like a federal vehicle were pulled over with a small convoy, 3 black SUVs with government plates. I slowed down, expecting to pass a routine traffic stop, but as I got closer, I realized this was something much bigger. The SUVs were positioned to block both lanes, forcing all traffic to a complete stop. Officers were directing cars and trucks to a temporary inspection area set up in a truck stop parking lot about a quarter-mile ahead. "Mandatory safety inspection," a trooper told me as I rolled down my window. "Pull into bay number 3. This wasn't normal. Random DOT inspections happen, but not coordinated operations with federal vehicles at 2:30 a.m. in the middle of nowhere. I parked where directed and watched other vehicles being inspected. Most cars were cleared quickly, but every commercial truck was getting thorough searches. They were looking for something specific. 2 agents approached my cab. One was FBI. I could see the badge. The other was wearing a DA jacket. "Evening, sir. We need to inspect your cargo." "Sure thing. I've got electronics equipment, Seattle to Miami. All documentation is in order." As they checked my paperwork, I heard radio chatter from their vehicles. They were coordinating with other checkpoints on multiple highways: I-40, I-17, I-10, and several state routes. This was a massive operation. This load originated from which facility? The FBI agent asked. Microsoft Distribution Center in Seattle. Building 7, Dock 14. The agents exchanged glances. We need to examine specific items in your trailer. Please step out of the cab. They had me open the trailer doors, and immediately focused on the boxes that had been loaded under special supervision. Using handheld scanners, they were checking each container. These aren't electronics, the DA agent said after scanning several boxes. These are medical supplies. Specifically, controlled substances. My blood ran cold. I'd been set up to transport drugs, and I had no idea. Sir, we need you to understand, you're not under arrest. Based on your documentation and route history, we believe you're an unwitting participant in a smuggling operation we've been tracking for 8 months. 8 months. That meant this operation had been running while I'd been making regular Seattle-Miami runs for Westfield Freight. How many times have you transported loads from this specific pickup location? The FBI agent asked. I thought back through my logbooks. Maybe 15 times in the past year. Always electronics, always the same route. Did you ever notice anything unusual about the loading process, the people involved, or the urgency of delivery? As I described the rush loading, the civilian supervisors, and the specific placement requirements, both agents took detailed notes. Sir, you've been transporting approximately $2.3 million in illegal pharmaceuticals per load. The operation you've unknowingly been part of has been moving nearly $35 million in controlled substances across state lines. The scope was staggering. But it got worse. We believe this smuggling network has been operating through multiple legitimate freight companies, using drivers who have no knowledge of the real cargo. The same organization has been involved in healthcare fraud, identity theft, and patient exploitation schemes across 6 states. Healthcare fraud. Patient exploitation. I remember news stories about hospital fraud cases in Pennsylvania, medical identity theft in Ohio, and suspicious deaths in care facilities across the Midwest. Are you saying this is connected to those medical fraud cases? We believe so. The profits from healthcare fraud operations fund the pharmaceutical smuggling network. They steal identities and insurance information, perform unnecessary procedures, then use the profits to purchase controlled substances for illegal distribution. They showed me surveillance photos from the Seattle facility. The 2 civilian supervisors I'd seen weren't Microsoft employees. They were part of the criminal network using the legitimate warehouse as a front. The electronics boxes contain real products to pass casual inspection, the DA agent explained. But hidden compartments hold pharmaceutical supplies stolen from hospitals, nursing homes, and medical facilities. The same network that's been targeting vulnerable patients for insurance fraud has been stealing medical supplies and narcotics. The pattern was becoming clear. Criminal organizations were infiltrating healthcare systems, stealing from vulnerable patients, fraudulently billing insurance companies, and using healthcare facilities to access controlled substances for illegal distribution. How long has this been going on? Based on our investigation, at least 3 years. The network includes corrupt healthcare workers, transportation coordinators, and administrative personnel across multiple states. They've been systematically targeting patients with limited family oversight, elderly individuals in long-term care, and people with cognitive impairments. I thought about all the regular runs I'd made, believing I was just transporting legitimate electronics. How many illegal drugs had I unknowingly moved across the country? What happens now? Your truck will be impounded as evidence, but you'll be released. We need your cooperation in identifying other potentially compromised loads and helping us understand the operational patterns. They had me review my logbooks for the past 2 years, identifying every load that had originated from the Seattle facility. The pattern was clear, approximately 2 loads per month, always the same route, always with the same rush loading procedures. We've been coordinating with other law enforcement agencies, the FBI agent said. Similar operations have been discovered in Texas, Florida, and North Carolina. The same criminal network appears to be operating through multiple freight companies and healthcare systems. The radio chatter continued throughout the inspection. They were coordinating arrests across multiple states, healthcare workers in Pennsylvania, administrators in Ohio, freight coordinators in California, and distribution managers in Florida. Tonight's operation is the culmination of an 8-month investigation, the DA agent explained. We've been tracking this network since reports of patient abuse and healthcare fraud led us to discover the pharmaceutical smuggling operation. By 4:30 a.m., they processed my truck and documented everything. They arranged for me to be transported to a nearby facility where federal investigators would take detailed statements about every load I transported. Mr. Morales, you've been an unwitting participant in one of the largest healthcare fraud and pharmaceutical smuggling operations we've ever investigated. The network you've been unknowingly supporting has victimized over 400 patients and moved nearly $70 million in illegal drugs. The numbers were staggering. 400 patients exploited for insurance fraud. $70 million in illegal pharmaceuticals. Multiple states involved in coordinated criminal operations. Over the next few days, I learned the full scope of what I'd been part of. The criminal network had been recruiting drivers from legitimate freight companies, using them to transport illegal materials while maintaining plausible deniability. Most drivers, like me, had no idea what they were really carrying. The healthcare fraud component was even worse. The same organization had been placing people in hospital jobs, nursing home positions, and medical facility roles specifically to access patient information and controlled substances. They'd been systematically abusing vulnerable patients while stealing medical supplies and narcotics. 18 people were arrested across 6 states. The operation included doctors, nurses, hospital administrators, freight coordinators, and distribution managers. They'd been operating for over 3 years, generating profits through patient exploitation and using those profits to fund pharmaceutical smuggling. The legal proceedings took months. I testified in federal court about the transportation operations, describing the loading procedures, the route requirements, and the unusual supervisory arrangements. My testimony helped establish the pattern of operations and the scope of the criminal network. Westfield Freight Lines cooperated fully with the investigation. They'd had no knowledge of the criminal activity and had been manipulated by the network just like their drivers. The company implemented new security procedures and background checks for all loading facilities. But here's what keeps me awake at night. How many other drivers are unknowingly transporting illegal materials? How many other freight companies have been compromised? How many healthcare facilities have been infiltrated by criminal organizations? The federal agents said this was just one network. They believe similar operations are active in other regions, using the same methods, infiltrating healthcare systems, exploiting vulnerable patients, and using legitimate transportation companies to move illegal materials. I've been driving for a different company since then, but every load makes me nervous. I check documentation more carefully, ask more questions about loading procedures, and pay attention to unusual supervisory arrangements. The thing that haunts me most is thinking about the patients who were victimized. Elderly people in nursing homes, vulnerable individuals in hospitals, people who trusted healthcare workers. They were being exploited to fund criminal operations that I was unknowingly helping to facilitate. 3 months after the arrests, a federal prosecutor called to tell me about the sentences. The main organizers got 25 to 30 years. Healthcare workers involved in patient exploitation received 15 to 20 years. The freight coordinators who recruited unwitting drivers received 8 to 12 years. But the prosecutor also said something that still worries me. This type of operation requires extensive planning, multiple criminal contacts, and sophisticated logistics. The people we arrested learned these methods somewhere, and they probably taught others. So here's my question for anyone who works in healthcare or transportation. Have you noticed unusual procedures, rushed operations, or people asking you to bend normal protocols? Have you seen loading operations that don't match standard procedures? And for families with loved ones in healthcare facilities, are you reviewing medical bills carefully? Are you asking questions about procedures and treatments? Are you staying in regular contact with vulnerable family members? Criminal networks are more sophisticated than most people realize. They don't just commit individual crimes, they infiltrate legitimate systems and use those systems to commit crimes on massive scales. The only way to stop them is people like us paying attention and speaking up when something doesn't seem right. I thought I was just doing my job, transporting legitimate freight across the country. But I was actually part of a criminal conspiracy that victimized hundreds of vulnerable patients and moved millions of dollars in illegal drugs. Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. And remember, criminal organizations count on people not asking questions, not paying attention, and not speaking up. The moment we start questioning unusual procedures and reporting suspicious activities, these networks start falling apart. Because after what I've learned, I'm convinced that operations like this are happening in more places than anyone wants to admit. And the only thing that's going to stop them is drivers, healthcare workers, and families staying alert and refusing to let these criminals hide behind legitimate businesses and trusted institutions. Thanks so much for watching. I can't express enough how much your support means. The likes, the comments, it all really helps the channel grow. If you enjoyed the video, make sure to hit that like button and share your thoughts in the comments below. I always take the time to read them. And don't forget to subscribe so you never miss out on any new videos. See you next time.